people who aren't validators aren't losing much because the validators just make a small profit, right? Obviously, if you pay validators 100x profit, it's kind of unfair to gatekeep who is a validator.
Is there a risk to having too many hard forks, or do you think this could actually bolster the social consensus and kind of rally the community on a more frequent basis, and we're not thinking about hard forks the right way?
Does proof of governance restrict assets from having this kind of like monetary premium? Is that even a real thing? Does that matter? Welcome back to the Rollup. We are your hosts. I'm Andy.
I'm Robbie, and this is your home to learn from the biggest guests, the brightest minds at the tip of innovation.
Our goal is to help spread the collective knowledge of everyone in our community.
We are breaking crypto out of its echo chamber and taking it to the real world.
John, welcome to the show, man. It's good to have you back.
Thank you for having me again.
Good to see you.
Welcome.
You definitely ruffled the feathers. Yeah, you've definitely been ruffling some feathers in the proof of stake camp. Maybe just quick, rewind. A month ago, you're somewhere writing up this proposal, thinking about the dynamic of proof of stake. As Zucky says, some of these ideas came from a hot tub from the Cosmos space. You're writing this proposal around proof of governance being the endgame for LSTs. What's going on in your mind? What kind of caused this thought? What series of thoughts led to you starting this idea? And then we're going to dive into some of the more technical stuff and go through it.
Yeah, so to kind of, first of all, I enjoyed watching your podcasts with various guests. I believe it was at Permissionless around the time that you were talking, around the time that you mentioned a bunch of people were talking about proof of governance or reducing staking issuance. That staking issuance is not yield, is not real yield. It's just a tax, things like that. I feel like very few people cited what inspired them to start talking about this narrative at that exact time. But I'm a bit biased, but I like to think that it was my post that kind of catalyzed all that.
You didn't get the credit that you deserve, but nevertheless, it did proliferate the zeitgeist.
Yeah, it's okay. I'm used to it by now. So what's the thinking behind this? So it started with the thought of, we have Celestia as a blockchain, we have 𝗃. We would like 𝗃 to be used in DeFi and all the things like that. And whenever you have a proof of stake token and you have a DeFi that is using that token, you end up in a situation where staking derivatives and LSTs and that kind of stuff might interfere with the yield in DeFi. Oh, sorry. Let me take that back. It's not that the staking derivatives interfere with the yield, but rather the staking yield interferes with the DeFi yield. And the way to counteract that is by the existence of staking derivatives like LSTs. And this is what kind of Tarun and his co-authors and co-conspirators kind of posited back in the day of when ETH2 was starting. Tarun and his co-authors basically said, that regardless of what you do on the primary chain, you're going to have staking derivatives, you're going to have LSTs, even if there's no in-protocol delegation. And therefore, it's kind of a losing battle to not have in-protocol delegation. Might as well embrace it. This turned out to be true, much to the dismay of the Ethereum consensus designers and implementers. Lido and a bunch of other LSTs ended up existing on Ethereum, and today, they control the majority, if not the super majority, of control. Control is a strong word. Don't read too much into that. They control the majority of stake on voting power on Ethereum. That's not a bad thing. Just kind of the natural consequence of staking yield kind of will compete with DeFi yield. And if you have a staking derivative, you can get both at the same time. Okay, no los dos. You can get your staking yield through a yield-bearing staking derivative, like staked ETH, as it were, or staked 𝗃 if it exists on Celestia. And you can get the yield from DeFi, lending, gambling, speculating, whatever the heck you want to do. So we're now in a situation where we have, that's kind of the background context of how we got to how this applies to Celestia. We have Celestia. We would like LSTs for Celestia. If 𝗃 is going to be used in DeFi, we would like LSTs for 𝗃. While doing background, literature review on the subject. I was told about John Charbonneau's post on proof of governance. Well, I was told about it. I guess I had known about it way back when it was first originally posted, and he did the presentation on this topic way back when. But I had kind of like memory hold it for a while because LSTs hadn't come up for a while. So I was presented with this. I read it, and I'm like, oh, this kind of makes sense. For what it's worth, I should say that while I wrote the post on the proof of governance proposal, it was primarily driven internally by 𝗫𝗫𝗀𝗃, our head of research at Celestia Labs, who was driving our internal LST design efforts. I just kind of published it as one does. Just publish research posts / blog posts to get ideas out there. But most of the effort was driven and kind of this notion of proof of governance and filling in some of the missing details in John Charbonneau's post was primarily driven by our head of research, 𝗫𝗫𝗀𝗃, just to give credit where credit is due. So what does John Charbonneau argue? He basically argues that in a sufficiently mature LST landscape, you end up with a way of selecting validators that isn't the same way that you do in kind of a naive, immature proof of stake way. It's not just I have some stake and then I delegate to a particular validator and then that's it. Right? It's going to be something a little more, let's say, intermediated. For example, let's consider kind of a spherical cow model where you have one single staking liquid staking operator. Let's say you had just Lido, and just Lido had 100% of staking with it. This makes sense because why would you leave yield on the table if you can liquid stake and also get DeFi yield and also do like looping and stuff? Like why would you leave yield on the table? That's kind of, you would not in any sufficiently mature system with little friction. And we should work to remove the frictions. Any sufficiently mature system, you would collect all the yield that you can collect. You wouldn't leave free money on the table. So okay, you have 100% of stake to a single liquid staking operator. So this does a few things. The first thing is the validators that this operator selects to actually be the validators of the system. That's how validators are selected, not through delegations to individual validators. So this is a type of governance thing where you can say like you kind of put your stake into this, Lido as an example, and then Lido is the one that actually selects the validators in this example.
Right.
Introducing Asset Runes, the future of decentralized finance. Stablecoins natively on Bitcoin. Hedge against volatility. Diversify your portfolio. All directly from your Bitcoin wallet. Secured by ZK technology. This is Asset Runes. Available now, exclusively on Starknet.
Another thing this does is that if 100% of tokens are staked, which again, if you have this mature system where people don't leave yield on the table, then 100, close or either 100 or close to 100 would be staked. Staking issuance is actually 0, the net issuance. The reason is that, let's suppose that you have Ethereum. It has some issuance. I forget what it was. Let's say it's 2% a year, right? They issue 2% of the ETH supply a year. This is just an example. I don't know the exact numbers. If 100% of ETH is staked, that issuance just goes back to the ETH holders. In other words, it's not actually real issuance because everyone gets more ETH, but ETH also gets diluted by 2%. So the yield is 2%, the inflation is 2%, it cancels out, and the real yield is 0. And this is why you have various people, including like Anatoly on Twitter, is very vocal about this point, but never kind of took the leap of faith of proposing actually making a change based on this point. But he keeps talking that proof of stake issuance is not real issue. It's not real yield. It's just a tax because you get yield, like fake yield, but then you get taxed, and then you have to pay taxes on this fake yield. It's kind of a giant scam, like capital gains tax. Exactly. It's just a tax. You if you're in a jurisdiction that the taxes you, then you pay taxes, and that's where the money goes. It just goes out of the system. No one's getting anything. So if you're in the situation, in this spherical cow model, 100% of tokens are staked. Real issuance is actually 0. So if real issuance is 0, it's arguable why would anyone stake? And also you have this LST operator that essentially decides the validator set. Can you just kind of get to this end system, but make it even better than that? And that's kind of where proof of governance comes in, which is we say, okay, well, let's skip over all the staking stuff, because if you have 100% staked and you don't actually get any yield, so why would anyone stake? Let's just skip over all this. Let's just do the validator selection part. And the reason this is fine is that validators aren't meant to secure the system, and they aren't meant to define what is valid. Validators are cogs. A common, this in different words is a common refrain in the Ethereum crowd when they compare and contrast how Bitcoin miners aren't supposed to control the system, right? And Ethereum miners back in the day when Ethereum is proof of work don't control Bitcoin and Ethereum. They might build additional blocks on top of the previous longest chain, but they don't define what Bitcoin and Ethereum blocks are valid. They don't define hard forks, et cetera, et cetera. All of this is done through social consensus, through deploying hard forks, getting communities and exchanges and users and developers and everyone to coordinate around upgrades, et cetera, et cetera. It's not done through miners or, in the case of proof of stake, validators deciding on the governance of the chain. The validators and miners are effectively are downstream of governance, not upstream of governance. So therefore, if you imagine a very simple and naive system, I'm not saying this is how proof of governance should be done, but you could imagine a very simple and naive system where you have in the software, you have a list of validators. And then those are your validators. No staking, no delegation, no nothing. Those are your validators. And then if any validator decides to misbehave, well, then you can penalize them in some way, exercise left for the reader, and then change them in the node software through a hard fork. Blockchain communities coordinate through hard forks anyways, and then the selection of the validators is automated through the node software as by hard coding them. So again, this is like a very naive, like minimally viable proof of governance implementation way you would do it. Potentially something in production would be more sophisticated than this, but that's just an example to get the listeners kind of a mental model of how it could work. And in this way, you now no longer need staking. You no longer need staking issuance. Therefore, you can cut issuance. And you can do various other things that make the token more, the tokenomics and the kind of value thesis of the token more obvious and more concrete and less confusing because of the existence of issuance as a fake yield. For example, what I proposed in my well, I shouldn't say what 𝗏𝗃 proposed that I then transcluded in my post on proof of governance is you can burn all transaction fees. Currently, in a lot of chains, transaction fees go to the validator that created the block. Cosmos chains, including Celestia, do it a bit differently, which is always weird, but they distributed it to all validators. But you can do even better, which is in the model where 100%, sorry, not all validators, they distribute it to all stake. So in the model where 100% of tokens are staked, well, then if you're going to distribute it to all stake, that's the same thing as just burning it. So instead of like from an accounting perspective, it's easier to burn it than distribute it to everyone because it's like a single state change to just burn a token as it's paid for fees versus if you had like to distribute a small amount of dust to everyone would be substantially more expensive from a state, like from a programming and state transition point of view. So you just burn the fees. So this makes now the value accrual thesis of the token much more obvious, which is that it's just directly and only and concretely the DCF really. It's how many fees do you expect the blockchain to have in the future? That's how much is going to burn, and therefore that's how much value is going to be driven to the token. You don't have to worry about the complexities of the fake issuance, the real issuance being fake yield, and things like that. So this system is substantially simpler than proof of stake systems. It allows you to reduce issuance substantially because now you essentially decouple the issuance you have to pay to validators, because even though validators are cogs, they do create blocks. That is a real cost to them, right?
Yeah.
And they need to be paid for this cost. So now instead of having this weird thing where you couple validator commission which is some variable with voting power, and they may have variable voting power, therefore they may have varying commissions, but their fixed costs for each validator is really the same. Or like why, like if you have 10% voting power versus 0.1% voting power, you still have to run the same full node to be a validator. So you have like all these weird things going on because you've coupled these things in proof of stake that don't need to be coupled. So okay, you just decouple them, and then the protocol can just pay validators what they need to be paid to be slightly, or potentially very profitable, whatever the social consensus of the chain decides, to be profitable in running their validator operations. And you can do so uniformly among all validators because you just know what that number is and you just pay them. And therefore, you don't have it's much simpler in how validators are paid, which is actually a nice thing. Now you might say, okay, well, what's the point of doing this? The reason it's nice is that currently you have this awkward situation where validators that are larger have economies of scale. This applies to both Cosmos chains and to Ethereum. For example, Ethereum says you need to run one validator node per validator, right? It turns out, and you can run like one beacon node for many validators, but you need one validator node that does some sort of amount of work per validator. And that work is, verifying some subset and attesting to some subset, right? The problem is that it turns out beyond some threshold, which is, I think, like a few thousand validators, it turns out you don't actually need to run additional validator nodes. You can just spin up additional keys. In other words, at a certain point, you just get economies of scale where you can spin up, let's say 1 million validators, well, maybe not that many, whatever, a large number of validators without incurring any additional physical costs to running nodes. So there are economies of scale there. The same applies to economies of scale in Cosmos style, Tendermint style chains, which is that the more voting power a validator has, the lower commission it can charge while still being more profitable, while a very small validator needs to charge a higher commission to stay profitable. Proof of governance lets us do this very nice thing where all validators in the chain all effectively have the same voting power. So it's all uniform, which means exactly, that everyone has the same costs and they have the same voting power in the consensus protocol, and therefore they can get the same rewards. Everything is completely uniform. And that makes a lot of things much easier when determining the economics of how much validators should be getting paid. There's also some further down things that I won't talk about. Like if you know that all the validators have equal voting power, it makes it easier to round robin and do some other things between them because you know that there's uniformity. Various things to do with gossiping, transaction and block propagation that I won't get into because it's too low level. But let's say there's a huge number of secondary benefits to having these validators have uniform voting power. So anyways, that's kind of the TLDR, that there's a huge number of benefits and it hugely simplifies how these consensus protocols work by changing the Sybil resistance mechanism from this delegated staking to governance directly. Because ultimately, even if you do delegated staking or staking with staking derivatives, which is still delegated staking just with extra steps, you still end up in a situation where you have some sort of governance deciding on the validators, just again with more steps. So might as well skip the steps and do it directly.
We don't want a very centralized staking provider, Lido, 100% exchanges, etc. Too, the entire idea of okay, we have all of this yield, but if the price of these different assets that we're staking is variable, you have to pay taxes, you have to deal with issuance as an expense from the protocol level. End users, they don't really know what they could get. If the asset's down 10%, you get 6%, you're actually losing, then you have taxes, etc. Third and final thing is that, we have a set of distributed 100, 200 validators with variable, amounts of stake in each, but the same fixed costs. What's the difference between having, a lot of these chains have no slashing, right? It's just kind of been something that needs to be implemented. Is it better just to have a set of validators that are effectively almost like a security council per se, trusted amongst the best of the best, and use a process of removing these validators rather than having to slash. Now, I do this recap and a summary for a second time for the reason, because I want to push back on something that, or at least I want to provide a chance for you to respond to what Ryan Sean Adams said when he screenshotted a news post and said, you know, it's of you explaining this proposal. And what he says is that if you do this to your L1 network, you're no longer in the non-sovereign store value game. And if you do this to your network, you probably never were, right? And then he goes on to say that the only two are Bitcoin and ETH. You know, does proof of governance restrict assets from having this kind of like monetary premium? Is that even a real thing? Does that matter? What would you respond to this take?
Sure. Well, I mean, so you could argue monetary premium is a meme, just like economic security was a meme. It's unclear to me that Ethereum and Bitcoin. Well, it's unclear to me that Ethereum exceptionalism isn't anything beyond a meme. Bitcoin exceptionalism definitely is. It's a meme, but in the good way, not a meme in the bad way, in the sense that Bitcoin exceptionalism has proven time. Bitcoin has proven time and again that it is exceptional and it does a monetary premium despite not having good properties, or properties that we would consider good. Ethereum, doesn't really have anything exceptional going for it beyond. Well, it doesn't really have anything exceptional going for it. With respect to, if you can do this or you can't do this, ultimately it's up to the community to decide. One thing that people have a hard time mental modeling around is they may see this and say, hey, this is just a consortium chain from back in the day. It's an enterprise consortium chain. How that's any different? The difference between this and consortium chains is the same difference between Ethereum and consortium chains. It's around the social consensus of what is the chain. Like, what is the given you have a chain and a hard fork of the chain with different rules. Which one is the valid one? That's like that's ultimately what social consensus decides. You can have various processes automating. You can argue that one is more automated than the other. These are all fine things to argue, and we can argue about them technically. But saying but these are the differences in automation are differences on a spectrum. They're not binary. There's not one thing is one thing and one thing is another thing. There's slight differences by degrees. Now, you can say, well, how is Ethereum store of value when they did the DAO hard fork? Right? Ethereum just goes and tells everyone to stop trading. Now you can say, oh, that was a long time ago. Sure, well, the Bitcoiners don't think it's that long ago, right? There's various criticisms that can be made, but ultimately, the difference between an enterprise chain and a consortium chain and something like a proof of governance or Ethereum today even is around the social consensus deciding which hard fork is valid. Because as long as you can hard fork, imagine you have a consortium chain. It has whatever, 5, 7 validators. The social expectation around the consortium chain and all the centralized exchanges that will accept deposits from this consortium chain. All of these, and the social expectation is the 7 validators run the consortium chain, and they're the only ones running the consortium chain. Maybe the code is closed source, et cetera, et cetera. But if the code is open source and the social consensus of the community is whatever's in the node, whatever's in that software, and whatever validators are decided by the governance, again, the decentralized governance deciding on the validators, that's who the validators are, and that's the blockchain. You can't have someone centralized show up and just say, I control the chain. Right? Like Celestia Foundation could show up and say, here are the validators. Then 99% of the validators are just the Celestia Foundation and the Celestia Foundation with a mustache. Right? And the Celestia Foundation with like the glasses and the mustache. Right? And then the community would say no. The ability of the community to say that, and more importantly, the social expectation and consensus that the community can and should do this, that's the differentiator between a consortium chain and a permissionless chain with proof of governance. So proof of governance does not imply permission that it's permissioned, and it does not imply that it's a consortium chain. It's still permissionless, it's still decentralized, it still has all the nice properties of blockchains, because all those properties are downstream of social consensus and not they're downstream of social consensus. And social consensus is kind of what defines the blockchain to be what it is. And that exists whether your consensus protocol is Tendermint or 𝗵𝗶𝗴𝗵 uses. I forget what name they ended up going with. And it doesn't matter if your symbol resistance mechanism is proof of work or proof of stake or proof of governance. None of those things matter because all of those are downstream of the social consensus.
So, John, if I'm understanding this correctly, the acceptance of new validators into the consensus mechanism would be determined by token holders, stakeholders that would vote on accepting these new validators into the system. And each time that happens, there's a hard fork. And effectively, there's kind of the social consensus that decides, okay, we're going to accept the new validator into the system and continue the chain on with this validator included in the selection process to build a new block. Every time, there's a theory that says every time there's a new hard fork, it splinters the community. That's the same reason Bitcoin Cash still has $10 billion of market cap and Ethereum Classic still has $3 billion of market cap. There's kind of the splinter of the Bitcoin community and the splinter of the Ethereum community that for, whether, even if it's just a market maker on some centralized exchange somewhere, that value is continuing on that chain and not on the consensus chain. And so would you agree that each time one of these hard forks happens, and it sounds like there's a lot greater velocity of hard forks, a lot more hard forks that happen in a short amount of time, it splinters the community and therefore loses some of the value here of the chain and the value, even if it's just denominated in market cap? Is there a risk to having too many hard forks, or do you think this could actually bolster the social consensus and kind of rally the community on a more frequent basis, and we're not thinking about hard forks the right way?
Yeah, so first of all, to address your first point around the specifics of the governance process, I don't think I discussed anything around the specifics, although I did give an example of one where you could just hard code it in the node software. The specifics, we're working on some proposals internally. Other people can propose things externally, but there's various ways in which you can execute this governance with various with participation from various parties, including token holders. So just because I say it's governance doesn't mean the token holders get no say whatsoever. Not necessarily they have no decision-making power, but that they have no say. No, that's of course wrong. Of course they can have a say. Of course, the votes of token holders can be surfaced. It just the mechanism which is done is not staking, it's governance. So that's the first point to clarify. Now onto the hard fork point. I guess we'll find out. Ethereum has done a bunch of hard forks throughout the years. Like there was the contentious hard fork around the DAO, and that splintered the community. But Ethereum has had many non-contentious hard forks, and those basically did nothing with respect to splintering, and they did a lot to bolster Ethereum as being the success that it is today. Because the Ethereum Classic chain that refused to hard fork, I guess, the Ethereum chain that does hard fork continuously to improve itself. One of these is worth whatever X billion of dollars. The other one is worth whatever Y million of dollars. So one approach is is better than the other, but it really, I don't think hard forks necessarily splinter things unless there's contention. But if there's contention, there would be contention anyways.
Innovating finance, global, institutional, and on-chain. Deep liquidity to drive capital efficiency. Now maximize yield on institutional grade liquid staking with 𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗵. Unlock $1 trillion of capital via 𝗵𝗶𝗶𝗵. All of this secured by Mantle's treasury of billions in stables and ETH capital pools. This entire ecosystem is coordinated by a vast network of seasoned VCs that are aiming to create the next generation of banking and financial technology. This is Mantle.
And the way in which that contention is resolved now is basically like one of those camps loses, and it's effectively like the way that we elect a political president. It's like just kind of half the country is unhappy for the next 4 years, and in the proposal of DAO, or it effectively feels like DAO governance, but it has a lot more significance on the outcome of the chain. In proof of governance, it's not just the case that kind of this camp is unhappy. They can continue in the case that they would like to, or they can kind of just defect, right, and join the winning fork that takes place. But I guess what you're saying is you don't expect too many of these contentious hard forks to occur. It's really just a matter of accepting new validators into the system, and paying those validators more cost plus model, rather than coming up with an arbitrary value in which we're going to inflate the supply and pass those on to validators.
Yeah, because currently it's this awkward situation where validators that are, and this kind of I touched on this earlier, is that validators that are on the top of the validator set are potentially highly profitable, and those in the bottom are less so. So it becomes this game where validators want to be in that very highly profitable top part of the set, but then the protocol has to figure out how to pay everyone to make sure people aren't too underpaid. But then you're overpaying the top percentage, et cetera, et cetera. It gets complicated to model, but also it can result in overpayment to validators because those at the top are overpaid. So it becomes this thing where validators try to get paid a lot in the current model. And that's not necessarily what you want. It would be nicer to have a model where validators are paid to be cogs to run run validator software that produces blocks, and they get paid by the protocol, their costs plus some profit. Not 100x profit, some respectable profit, so that people will do it. But because of this change in how validators can be compensated and will be compensated, they'll make a profit. Don't get me wrong, but it means they won't have to search for the 100. They won't have to hunt and play games and stuff for the 100x profit. What that means is also that there won't necessarily be huge competition to run a validator, and therefore I don't expect a million people wanting to run a validator. The people who want to run validators may have some secondary services that they can provide along with running a validator node that they can amortize cost on and stuff like that, right? Maybe they run a Rollup as a service and they also run a validator on the side, things like that. So because of that, I don't expect a large churn in the validator set, and therefore there's not really any reason to change it. People who aren't validators aren't losing much because the validators just make a small profit, right? Obviously, if you pay validators 100x profit, it's kind of unfair to gatekeep who is a validator. If the validator just does their thing, they're on as validators, they make a small profit, small but respectable profit. Sure, I guess it's nice to be a validator, but at the same time, you could just not be a validator and put your money into DeFi and make potentially more yield if you want to take some risks, right? So the how validators will be compensated will be more optimized, and therefore you won't have people playing political games to try and be a validator. Like the process will be much more mechanical. It'll be much more, okay, I'm a validator, I just run my software and that's it, I get paid some profit, and therefore anyone can.
Yeah, it is a political game today. I mean, yeah, bro.
I've just got one more follow-up. And you mentioned that optimizing the value equation to pay validators is going to bring the cost that it to them way down, or excuse me, to the protocol way down, right? And you mentioned that opens up a variety of use cases that you can do. You can, for instance, burn all of the transaction fees. That's an amazing value accrual thesis for a gas token. You could also lower the rate of inflation potentially all the way down to zero. This is kind of where my question is. I guess my question is who, even if it's, the cost of the protocol, right? Protocol kind of in quotations here, is much lower because you've optimized the value equation. Who is the one that pays whatever cost that there still is to validators? If it's not coming from transaction fees, is it coming from still inflating the supply, albeit much less? Or is it really just like a servicing agreement with these validators in which could be paid in fiat or stables or from venture funding, really just as a software as a service, doesn't necessarily even have to be tokens?
Yeah, so the way that's most intrinsically incentivized is the protocol issues a small amount of new tokens just for the validators. So this wouldn't be given to stakers because there's no stakers. It would just be given to the validators, but it could be a very small amount of tokens. We've also been thinking internally, again, by we I mostly mean Nashku, since he's the one driving this, around how you could do things like pay them in stable coins, because they have their costs in stable coins, and it's awkward when they get paid costs in some fluctuating token, which may go up or down. So it could end up the protocol overpays or underpays them, neither of which scenarios are good. If they're paid in a stable coin, then they know exactly what they're going to be paid, which is potentially very nice. and it's also nicer from the protocol perspective. This requires, knowing the exchange price potentially, because you can't issue new stable coins. You can't issue US dollars, for example, but you can issue, if it's, it's Celestia protocol, it can issue TIA. So you need to know the exchange rate, blah, blah, blah. So there's some things to be done, but regardless, you can, the issuance wouldn't be dropped to 0, it would be dropped substantially. Like we're talking 20, potentially 40x.
Yeah, I think I saw it was like 20, like a fourth of a percent annually or something like that.
Yeah.
Last thing for you. Yeah.
And then at such prices, the value accrual thesis of the token becomes very compelling and very interesting, because it goes from having to burn fees that beat the issuance and then more, to, if you want the token to be deflationary and have effectively net buybacks of the token, now you only need to burn a quarter of a percent or less, and suddenly that is much more in the much more feasible range. Like I think someone did some math internally, and we're looking at numbers like, if you get $10,000 or $20,000 in fees a day, which is substantially less than protocols like Hyperliquid, like $10,000 of fees a day. If there's large DA demand and stuff like that, is quite easily achievable. You get that, and suddenly TIA is deflationary. So the value accrual thesis of these tokens that will adopt proof of governance becomes much more obvious, because burning transaction fees, etc. There's no indirection. It's just okay. Here's how the thesis becomes obvious, and then the actual amount also becomes better, because you don't have to surpass inflation and issuance in terms of the fees burnt. And again, the issuance is okay. You set some high number, and then you pay half of it in taxes. Well, what's the point?
Taxes, man. Don't get us started on that.
I think this is the crux of the proposal, right? It's still, and I think, it's a very thoughtful proposal with a lot of detail, but it is almost somewhat revolutionary in the way that we're thinking about proof of stake, and now thinking that there is something better out there, and it's so different, but yet you still have this somewhat of the same inputs and outputs. You still have some inflation, and you still have some tokens that are burned, and you get these validators that are providing a service. The only difference is that rather than overpaying all of the top validators and underpaying all of the lower validators, you're now optimizing the value equation so that the tokens that you burn are effectively, those would be passed to the validators if it was like, Bitcoin after the block reward is reached, right? Validator or miners in that case would get these transaction fees. But if that was the case, then in the current setup, they would be massively overpaying the top miners and underpaying the bottom ones. And this sort of balances the scales so that we're still using the value that is flowing through the system to pay for the upkeep of the system. We're just balancing that equation quite a bit more by unbundling the validators with the activity going through the system.
Yeah, and for what is, we didn't really touch on this part, but in terms of the security of the system can actually be very secure against corruption, potentially even more so than proof of stake and proof of work systems, right? Proof of work is a bit interesting. Can't really do that to the same extent in proof of stake in some scenarios, but regardless, the point being, in proof of work and proof of stake, you can corrupt a small number of operators, and then because of the principal agent problem, you just corrupt the operators. You don't have to buy stake to overcome the amount staked. Like a lot of people when they model security, they say, "Oh, you have to buy a bunch of tokens." It's like, no, you don't. You just go to if you're the government, you go up to Lido and say, "Hey, Lido, I want you to start forking Ethereum," right? And Lido company will do that, whether they like it or not, because the alternative is to go to prison. Right? Now, there's not to say Lido is bad. Far from it, actually. They seem to be quite good actors, right? But the reality is that you just go and corrupt operators. With proof of governance, you can get you can have a thing where part of the governance process around deciding who is the validator or not is not just looking at a blind list of validators and saying, "Oh, I'm going to choose the top one because the top one gives me has the lowest commission because they have economies of scale," right? Or like if you're in a mining pool, it's not just I'm going to choose the top mining pool because they have the lowest commission, again because of economies of scale. Right? There's no commission to be there's no staking, therefore there's no commission on the proof of governance validator selection. So you can have things like geo distribution, hosted versus bare metal distribution. platform distribution. Maybe some people use Linux, some people use Mac to reduce platform dependency risk. Things like that. That allow you to have a large number of validators that are geographically distributed in different jurisdictions. And then to corrupt the proof of stake protocol, you would need 1/3 or 2/3 of the validator set, which in the case of Celestia is 100 validators. So to corrupt 1/3 of them is 33. This would give you a Nakamoto coefficient of 33, while Ethereum's Nakamoto consensus coefficient for 1/3 of the voting power is like 2. Right? So now you end up in a situation where you have to corrupt a substantially larger number of entities that are geographically distributed, and you can choose them such that there aren't 33 validators in any one jurisdiction. So you have to do things like cross-jurisdictional collaboration if you want to corrupt them. So it can actually be very secure, potentially under certain attack scenarios, more secure than any other proof of work or proof of stake protocol that exists today. That's not to say that they're more secure under all scenarios, but under certain scenarios, especially the ones that people are talking about with respect to government overreach or government reach, depending on your positioning and governments, and World War III style scenarios, this geographic distribution and this Nakamoto coefficient actually becomes very important. And that's where proof of governance really excels
John,
at.
thank you for your time and for your work in the space. I appreciate the in-depth explanations and thoughts, as well as the spicy takes. You'll see some of those on your timeline later. I appreciate.
God, I hope not.
Validators or cogs is definitely a bold one. I think we may see some chatter about that. Thanks, John, for giving us a laugh and also sharing a lot of this really, really great info.
Awesome. Thanks for having me.
Speak to you soon.